Thank you very much. My name is Shannon Kowalski. I'm from the International Women's Health Coalition, and I'm speaking on behalf of the Women's Major Group. When the international community began thinking about the post-2015 development agenda, we were asked to think big, about the future we wanted and the type of world we wanted. And we, as the Women's Major Group, did. We began to think about a development agenda that would go beyond meeting people's basic needs to how we could transform structures, institutions, and societies to achieve justice, equality, and the realization of human rights for all. We felt strongly that there would be no development and no progress unless there was a clear and uncompromising commitment to the full realization of human rights. We demanded that the post-2015 agenda be firmly rooted in human rights obligations, including CEDAW, and build on the commitments from UN conferences of the 90s and their follow-ups, especially Rio, Vienna, Beijing, and Cairo. We called for accountability mechanisms that would use and build on existing mechanisms, including the Universal Periodic Review. We urged particular attention to extraterritorial obligations, that states and not the private sector be primarily responsible for implementation, and that the private sector be held to account for their violations of human rights, and not just through voluntary mechanisms. We demanded deep and structural changes to existing global systems of power, decision-making, and resource sharing, and for a progressive policy framework that aimed to fairly redistribute wealth, resources, and power to achieve social, economic, ecological, and redistributive justice. And we called for a framework that would tackle intersecting inequalities and multiple forms of discrimination based on sex, gender, age, class, caste, race, ethnicity, sexual orientation, gender identity, and abilities. And as women, we called for women's human rights and gender inequalities to be addressed specifically and throughout the post-2015 framework. And many governments, UN agencies, and other stakeholders agreed. The words transformative and visionary were used extensively in those early heady days. Unfortunately, we see as the Open Working Group's work is coming to an end, and as we've seen over the last week at the high-level political forum, we fear that many of those goals have been discarded, but not by women. Instead of asking about how we can achieve the world we want, governments are instead asking how we prioritize and set an agenda that's feasible, realistic, and easy to communicate. Instead of talking about how we work together, civil society and governments in partnership to achieve it, the role of major groups and other stakeholders have been marginalized and our participation constrained in the last week. We've been kept out of the agenda setting for the high-level political forum, restricted from accessing documents and attending meetings, including the informals on the political declaration, despite the fact that the GA resolution that established the HLPF was clear about extending the rights that major groups had to participate in the Commission on Sustainable Development to this body. Instead of working towards achieving human rights and social justice for all, we've seen that in prep comms for the SIDS conference, the HLPF Ministerial Declaration, and in some discussions at the Open Working Group, that some governments are far too ready to trade away human rights, and particularly their commitments to gender equality, women's rights, and sexual and reproductive rights for other political gains. This must stop. Women's bodies, lives, and rights are not a negotiating chip. And instead of addressing the very real threats we face as a result of climate change, governments are instead trying to keep climate change out of development negotiations. We, the Women's Major Group, say clearly and strongly this is not good enough. This is not the world we want. We need to revive the ideals, principles, and vision we had at the beginning of this process. We need strong accountability mechanisms. We count on the high-level political forum to not just be a political talk shop, but to be the body we hoped it would be. And to do this, we require a number of things. First, we must preserve the role of the Division on Sustainable Development to coordinate major groups and members of civil society working on sustainable development. We oppose efforts to incorporate that and the non-governmental liaison service under the DESA NGO branch. We feel strongly that doing so would undermine the past 20 years of work to build a major group structure and process that is accountable, transparent, and inclusive, and which has greatly contributed to global debates on sustainable development. And along those lines, we emphasize that we must preserve and strengthen the major group structure, including by ensuring that the HLPF involves major groups and other stakeholders in the way GA Resolution 67-290 intended. Second, the high-level political forum must have its own bureau and its own secretariat, which should be the Division on Sustainable Development, in order to ensure that it is fully equipped to take up its role in overseeing implementation of the post-2015 development agenda. We cannot overstress the importance of a well-resourced secretariat with specialized knowledge to respond to the many challenges we will face in the implementation of the SDGs over the next 20 years. Third, the HLPF must not just be a review mechanism, it must be an accountability mechanism. It should be the place where we can discuss and debate the challenges we face in implementing the SDGs and post-2015 development agenda, and where we can agree on meaningful solutions. An essential part of this is a peer review mechanism.
Can I ask you to come to, I mean, we only have a few minutes left and I'll have to shorten all the other speakers after you.
Okay.
Thanks.
We urge governments to work hand in hand with us, to be willing to be courageous, to make the changes that will make the difference. It's only then that we'll be able to fight poverty, achieve sustainable development and gender equality, the full realization of women's human rights and social justice for all.
Thank you.